Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 18, the volitional conjugations in the Hebrew verb system, the imperative, the cohortative, and the jussive. Now these are the command forms in Hebrew, and we're going to study each one in their turn. Look at your screen with me. The term volitional describes those conjugations used as a general rule to express some type of command, wish, or desire. And in Hebrew, we usually talk about three different volitional conjugations or volitional forms, each having their own distinct person. For example, the imperative is the second person volitional conjugation, the cohortative is the first person volitional conjugation, and the jussive is the third person volitional conjugation. So we're going to talk about each of those different volitional conjugations in this chapter. These are the command forms, those forms that express a command, a wish, or desire. The imperative, the cohortative, and the jussive that describe second, first, and third person commands, wishes, or desires. We'll begin our discussion with the Cal imperative, the second person command in the volitional conjugation system. Look at your screen with me. You will see the Cal imperative strong verb paradigm. Notice that all of the forms are second person, 2ms, 2fs, 2mp, and 2fp. Let's read the imperative conjugation paradigm together. Ketol, kitli, kitlu, ketolna. Once again, ketol, kitli, kitlu, ketolna. You will notice that in three of the four forms, there is a distinct sufformative that identifies the person, gender, and number of the imperative form. In the 2ms, there is no distinctive ending. The second thing you'll observe is that each of these sufformatives is identical to the imperfect sufformatives for the same person, gender, and number. In the 2fs, that's hirik yod. In the 2mp, it's the shurik. And the 2fp, it's the nun kametz he, or na. Each of these forms are translated in the same way, kill, or you kill. It's a violent translation, but it works for our paradigm verb. Now, I just said that each of these forms looks like, in some fashion, the imperfect form that corresponds in the person, gender, and number categories. That's because the imperative form is derived from or related to the imperfect form that you've already learned. Let's look at another slide together. Here you will see three columns on the page where we're trying to demonstrate how the imperative form is derived from the imperfect form. And it's quite simple. You'll begin in the imperfect column on the very left, and you'll recognize the four second person forms of the imperfect. Tiktol, tiktali, tiktalu, tiktolna. Next you'll move to the middle column where you will see that we have removed the imperfect preformative from the form. We've highlighted it in red and separated it with a vertical line. The way in which we get the imperative form is this. We begin with the imperfect form, we subtract the preformative, as we've done in column 2, highlighted in red, and then we can move to our imperative form at the very right column. You'll only notice one slight spelling change in the 2fs and the 2mp. Look at those forms with me on your screen. You'll see that the imperative 2fs and 2mp, the forms have gone from two shawahs at the beginning of a word to hirik followed by a silent shawah. You already know why this happens. It's the rule of shawah number 1. Two vocal shawahs cannot stand at the beginning of a word, and so the first vocal shawah changes to hirik and the second vocal shawah changes to the silent shawah. Let me try and demonstrate how this works. I'll begin by writing out the 2fs form of the imperfect from our paradigm verb, katal. The form is tiktali. Now, in order to arrive at the imperative, we want to slice off or remove the imperfect preformative. Once we've sliced off the imperfect preformative, we can remove it in its entirety. We're now left with a verb that begins with two vocal schwas. This is not kosher in Hebrew. Because of that, we must apply rule of schwa number 1. That is, the first vocal schwa changes to hirik, and the second vocal schwa now changes to silent schwa. We've gone from tik to li to kitlu. Kitlu. The reason I've demonstrated how this particular form changes is this. Even though you must memorize the imperative conjugation, the 4 forms, kitol, kitli, kitlu, kitolna, it's very helpful to know where these forms are derived from. Why? Because if you ever get stuck, you know that the basic endings are the same as the imperfect. And you've already memorized the perfect and the imperfect conjugations like a robot. You must also memorize the imperative conjugation like a robot. However, there is correspondence, and the more you can relate forms and conjugations one to another, the easier it will be to understand how the forms work and how they identify the second person together. In addition to the regular form of the Cal imperative 2ms, we also need to talk about the lengthened form of the Cal imperative 2ms. Look at your screen with me. In certain instances, a kametz he may be added to the 2ms form of the imperative. It is thought that the lengthened form of the imperative is either a polite form or an emphatic form. Now, we don't actually know whether it's polite or emphatic or what it's doing in every case. In fact, you'll probably just translate the lengthened form just like the short form at the very beginning, and that's okay. But look at your screen with me now. You will see 3 columns: the lexical form of the verb, the regular imperative 2ms form, and then the lengthened imperative form. You will see that in the lengthened category, a kametz he has been added to each form of the verb. Additionally, the vowel under the first root letter has changed. In the first 3 examples, you'll see a kametz hatuf, kot la, shom ra, shof ta, the short O vowel, kametz hatuf. In the 4th example, you'll see that sometimes you can get a hirik under the first root letter, shim-a. This particular type of lengthened imperative is not overly common, occurring only 242 times in the Hebrew Bible. However, that is enough that you'll want to be aware of it, so when you encounter it, it's not new or it doesn't catch you off guard. So just remember, only in the 2ms category, the first category, not the other 3, in the 2ms category, you will occasionally see, in fact, at 242 times in the Hebrew Bible, a lengthened form. That is a form with an extra he at the end. Now, other forms in the verbal system are also going to take an additional he. Sometimes the imperfect, sometimes the infinitive construct. So you'll begin to see that this particular morphological feature, this peculiarity with verbs taking extra he's, is not restricted just to the imperative. So again, what we're learning now is going to apply to other situations down the road. There's one final thing worth noting before we move on to the other volitional conjugations, and that's the fact that the imperative verb or imperative verbs will occur occasionally with the particle na. That is a little word that will follow the imperative. Look at your screen with me. Imperatives, along with other volitional conjugations, may be followed by the particle na. It will appear with or without the makef. This particular particle can be translated as please or simply left untranslated. This is one of those other unique features about the language that we don't know exactly why it exists. There's speculation about it, but we're not certain. So for now, you can either begin by translating the particle na as please or simply leaving it untranslated. But now let's look at the examples. Here you'll see on the left part of your screen, shamor na or shamor na. Both examples are translated in one of 2 ways: observe or please observe. Whether or not you translate the particle na will be up to you at this point. You'll also observe that it can be spelled with or without the makef. When it's spelled without the makef, as the first example shows, the regular spelling of the imperative is maintained. The vocal schwa under the first root letter and the holum stem vowel. If it is spelled with a makef, the imperative verb will surrender its accent to the particle na, and it will cause the holum stem vowel to reduce to kametz hatuf, shamor na. So you now know that in addition to the 4 forms of the imperative that you must memorize, you've also learned that in certain instances, the 2ms form of the imperative will occur with an extra he, or sometimes the imperative may be followed by the particle na. The cohortative and adjussive that we'll study also can be followed by the same particle. So you'll see this particle floating around in the next couple of chapters. Let's move on now to our study of the cohortative. The cohortative is the first person volitional conjugation. Look at your screen with me. The cohortative is used to express a wish, request, or command in the first person. The unaugmented form of the cohortative is the same as the imperfect in the 1CS and the 1CP. Let me state that again for you. The cohortative form is identical in form to the imperfect 1CS and 1CP. There is, therefore, no new paradigm or no new form to learn with the cohortative volitional conjugation. It's the same as the imperfect, and you use the 1CS or the 1CP. That's good news. Now back to our screen. What identifies the volitional use of the first person imperfect is the position of the imperfect verb in its clause. This is when word order becomes important. When the non-consecutive imperfect 1CS or 1CP verb is first in its clause, it will be cohortative. When the imperfect 1CS or 1CP is not first in its clause, it is not cohortative, but the regular imperfect. When you translate the cohortative, you can use the key words let or may. Let me do this, may I do this. Let us do this, may we do this. Now, this is an important factor in the language. Word order in verbal clauses. In English, we normally have our verbs following subjects or at the beginning of the sentence, like with imperatives. However, in Hebrew, you can put your verbs in a number of different locations, first or non-first. The position of the imperfect verb in its clause is very important, and it will only occupy one of two slots, the first position or the non-first position. Let's look at how that works with the cohortative. On your screen, you will see two sets of examples. Let's look at the first two examples together. The first one reads, Na'aseh Adam B'Tsalmenu, and it's translated, let us make man in our image. The verb na'aseh, that is first in its clause, is translated as a cohortative, let us make. We're using the key word let in our translation of the cohortative verb na'aseh. You'll notice that the form of the cohortative verb is identical to the regular imperfect. Look at our second example. Kol asher deber Yahweh na'aseh. You will notice in this example that the imperfect verb is not first, it's in the non-first position. And look at the translation. Everything that Yahweh has spoken, we will do. Now compare the two translations. The translation in the first line, let us make. The translation in the second line, we will do. You'll observe that both verbs are identical. Na'aseh in the first clause, na'aseh in the second clause or second example. However, because the position of the verb is different in each case, we translate the verb in the first case as cohortative and in the second place as imperfect or imperfective. In Hebrew, the position of the verb in its clause, specifically in this case, the position of the imperfect verb in its clause, will determine whether or not you have a cohortative or a regular imperfect. And here's the rule. If the imperfect verb is first and a non-wow consecutive verb, it'll be cohortative. If it's not first, it'll be the regular imperfect. Let's look at a second example that will show you the exact same thing. The second set of examples. E'avor b'chol zonka. Let me pass through all of your flocks. The second example. Ki e'avor b'kir b'cha. For I will pass through your midst. Notice that in each example, you have the exact same cal imperfect 1CS verb. In the first example, the imperfect verb is first, and so we translate it as the volitional verb, the cohortative verb, let me pass. In the second instance, the verb is not first in its clause, so we translate it like the regular imperfect, for I will pass. The verb form is the same, but the translation is different because of the position of the verb in its clause. Now, that's good news, and that's some bad news. Let's begin with the good news. The good news is that when it comes to the cohortative, there are no new verb forms to learn. You already know the verb forms because they're identical to the regular cal imperfect, 1CS, and 1 CP. Now, like the imperative, sometimes you will get an extra comet say at the end of a cohortative verb, but not always. You can't use that as a reliable guide for identification. The reliable guide for identification is the position of the verb in its clause. So the good news is no new paradigms. The bad news is this: you have to be very careful to observe the position of the verb in its clause in order to translate it correctly. Now, Hebrew only has two main verbal conjugations for many of the different conjugations or things that we do in Hebrew, the perfect and the imperfect. Now, those two Hebrew conjugations do what over a dozen conjugations do in English. That means the Hebrew conjugations do double, triple, and quadruple duty in many cases. The way in which Hebrew identifies these different uses is by the position of the verb in its clause and other contextual features. When it comes to the imperfect, if the verb is in first position and first person, it's cohortative. If it's in non-first position and first person, it's not cohortative, the regular imperfect. When you want to negate a cohortative verb, we're going to use the negative particle al, sometimes followed by the particle na. Look at your screens with me. Cohortative verbs are negated with al. This construction expresses a negative or a milder form of prohibition than that expressed by lo plus the regular imperfect. The particle na is sometimes attached to al with the makef, al na. In most instances, you will not need to translate the particle na. Remember that imperative verbs are not negated. That is to say, the imperative is never negated. The imperative is always an admonition, a positive command. Let's look at our example. Al na no vada. Once again, al na no vada. Do not let us perish. Notice that this negative command, notice in this example that the cohortative is negated with al followed by na. You will also notice in this cohortative form on your screen that the regular cohortative form in the 1CS has taken an extra comet say ending. This is just like the imperative. Sometimes the cohortative will take the extra comet say ending. It does not affect in any way the vocalization of the verb to which it's suffixed. It will simply appear as an unaccented comet say. Therefore, it will not affect the accent or the syllable structure of the verb. Now it's time to turn our attention to the jussive conjugation, or the third person volitional conjugation in the Hebrew verb system. Remember, the imperative is the second person volitional conjugation, and for the imperative, you must memorize the imperative paradigm, those four forms, kitol, kitli, kitlu, kitolna. Memorize them like a robot. With the cohortative, or the first person conjugation, the form of the verb in that particular instance is identical to the regular imperfect. You don't need to memorize any paradigms, but you have to recognize that those verbs are made cohortative by their position in their clause. They occur first, and they're always first person. The jussive volitional conjugation is the third person volitional conjugation. Look at your screen with me. The jussive is used, like the cohortative, to express a wish, request, or command, but this time in the third person. In general, the form of the jussive is the same as the imperfect. That's good news. No new paradigms to memorize here. What identifies the volitional use of the third person imperfect is the position of the imperfect verb in its clause, just like the cohortative. When the non-consecutive imperfect, 3ms, 3fs, 3mp, or 3fp verbs are first in their clause, it is jussive. When the imperfect verb is not first in its clause, it is not jussive, but the regular imperfect. When translating the jussive, just like the cohortative, you can use the key words let or may. Now, again, with the jussive conjugation, we're going to be taking over a number of things that we learned with the cohortative. First, the jussive form is identical to the regular imperfect form in most cases. The way in which you identify the jussive conjugation or the jussive nuance of the imperfect verb is by the position of that verb in its clause. If you have a third person imperfect verb and it's first in its clause, it'll be jussive. If you have a third person imperfect verb and it's not first in its clause, it will not be jussive, it'll be the regular imperfect. Let's look at some examples that identify this. Let's look at the first two examples together. Yizkor na hamelech eth Yahweh. Let the king remember Yahweh. Now look at the second example. Ata yizkor awonam Now he will remember their iniquity. You will see in these two examples the imperfect 3ms verb yizkor in both instances, highlighted in red. In the first example, the imperfect verb is first in its clause, and therefore we translate it with the jussive nuance using the key word let. Let the king remember. In the second example, we have the identical imperfect verb, yizkor. However, this case, it's not first in its clause. It appears as the second word. And so we translate it with the regular imperfect nuance, something like the future. Now he will remember their iniquity. The same verb, but two different translation values, and those two different translation values are determined by the position of the imperfect verb in its clause. Let's look at the other set of examples. Yishpot Yahweh, b'nei uvenecha. Secondly, wahu yishpot, tevel b'tzedek. Again, in these two examples, we have the exact same imperfect 3ms verb, yishpot in the first, yishpot in the second. In the first example, the imperfect verb is first in its clause. Therefore, we translate it with the volitional nuance, may Yahweh judge between me and between you. In the second example, the imperfect verb is not first in its clause. It follows wahu. And so we translate it not volitionally, but as the regular imperfect, something like the future. And he will judge the world with righteousness. So like the cohortative, there's both good news and bad news. The good news is there are no new paradigms to remember. The imperfect form is the same as the jussive form, the third person imperfect. The bad news is that you must maintain a level of sensitivity when reading Hebrew to look for the position of the verb. The position of the verb will identify the jussive or the cohortative nuance and distinguish it from the regular imperfect nuance. Now, just by general observation, it may be helpful to know that the vast majority of verbs in the Hebrew Bible are the regular imperfects. There are many fewer verbs in the cohortative and jussive. However, they do occur enough so that you must be aware of this phenomenon. Otherwise, you won't be able to translate accurately, and if you can't translate accurately, that will impede your ability to interpret accurately. Now let's look at your screen together. One of the characteristic features of the jussive volitional form is that it likes to appear as a short form. Now you'll recall from our previous study of the imperative and the cohortative that sometimes those forms will lengthen by adding comma te. The jussive is just the opposite. The jussive likes to become short, or it likes to shorten. Let's read this paragraph together on your screen. Approximately 23% of the time, the spelling of the jussive, 3ms or 3fs, is a shortened form of the imperfect. These shortened forms are most common in the third Hay class of weak verbs, but they also occur in biconsonantal and hifil verbs. Now you'll recall from our study of the wow consecutive that when you prefix the wow consecutive to third Hay verbs or biconsonantal verbs, the wow consecutive retracts the accent and it causes either the medial vowel letter of the biconsonantal verb or the Hay, the third root letter of the third Hay verb, to drop off. Okay? That same shortening also appears with jussive verbs. Let's look at your screen again. You will see 3 columns of verbs on your screen. In the first column, we're simply looking at the Cal perfect 3ms, that is, the lexical form of third Hay verbs. Bana, asa, Allah, and haya. In the second column, you're seeing the imperfect 3ms form. Yivneh, ya'aseh, ya'aleh, yihya. In the third column, you're going to look at these forms, but this time they're the shortened jussive 3ms forms. Yivin, ya'as, ya'al, yahi. In each case, the final Hay has dropped off. This is the exact same phenomenon that occurs when you prefix the wow consecutive to the imperfect of third Hay verbs. So you can think of it this way. Third Hay verbs, super weak verbs, they're always causing some problems. In the imperfect conjugation, the Hay in the third Hay verb is going to drop off whenever it can. When a third Hay verb is prefixed with a wow consecutive, the Hays will drop off. When a third Hay verb appears in the volitional nuance with the jussive, the Hay will drop off. So you will get short forms with third Hay verbs, both with the jussive nuance, the jussive third person volitional conjugation, and with the while consecutive. This phenomenon is important. It's important to recognize for this reason. If you see a shortened form at the beginning of a sentence, you'll immediately know it's jussive. You'll have two factors to identify the jussive conjugation for you, both its position in the clause and the fact that it's shortened. Now, by recognizing the short form, you'll be able to also reconstruct the original root letter, that he, and therefore properly identify the lexical form properly translated. And if you don't know the translation, then you can accurately look it up in the lexicon. Without recognizing the ability of third he verbs to shorten, you won't be able to identify the verb and translate it properly. Let's look at how these short forms might appear in context. Look at your screen with me. Here you will see two examples of the verb bana, but the first example is short and the second is long. Let's read the first example together. Vayiven eth Beit Yahweh, and let him build the house of Yahweh. Here you will see that the verb yiven is first in its clause. Now let me just note that when you see the wow prefixed to the imperfect, the wow does not count as displacing the first position of the verb. The wow is included with the verb, and therefore the wow and the verb together are in first position. Because the verb yiven is first in its clause, it's translated with a volitional nuance, and let him build. But look at the second example. Hu yivneh bayith lishmi. He will build a house for my name. Both of these verbs are parsed, kal, imperfect, 3ms, from the verbal root bana. However, the first verb exhibits the volitional nuance, and therefore the he is dropped off because the jussive prefers, when it can, in the third he verbs, the short form. However, the regular imperfect will always maintain the he when a sufformative has not been added to it. So in our second example, the he has been maintained, hu yivneh, and it's translated as the regular imperfect. You will also see short forms with the while consecutive. Let's look at your screens together once again. Here you will see Vayiven Noach mizbeach leYahweh, and Noah built an altar to Yahweh. Notice the verb in first position. Here you have the kal imperfect, 3ms from bana, with the while consecutive. In this case, you have the third he verb, and it's short, but we're not translating it with a volitional nuance. Why? Because here you have the imperfect verb prefixed with the while consecutive. And a verb prefixed with the while consecutive will never have a volitional nuance. Let me say that again. An imperfect verb prefixed with the while consecutive will never have the volitional nuance. So let's look at the second example. Vayal Moshe el har ha-Elohim, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. Here you have the kal imperfect 3ms from Allah, ayin lamed he, with the while conversive, with the while consecutive. You will notice that this verb is first in its clause and short, but I didn't translate it with a volitional nuance because it has the while consecutive prefix to it, and imperfect verbs with the while consecutive will not exhibit the volitional nuance. Like the first person volitional conjugation, the cohortative, the third person volitional conjugation, the jussive, is also negated with the negative particle al. Let's look together at the screen. Wa'al yachar afecha ba'avdecha. Do not let your anger burn against your servant. You will see the negative particle al followed by the third person imperfect jussive, yachar. The presence of the negative particle al negates the jussive verb. So it's not let your anger burn against your servant, it's the negative, do not let your anger burn against your servant. Now this is an important distinction to know. Number one, the imperative verb is never negated in Hebrew. It's always a positive command, an admonition. The cohortative and the jussive verbs can be negated, and they're only negated with al. So if you ever see an imperfect verb negated with the negative particle lo, it will not be cohortative or jussive. If you see an imperfect verb negated with al, it may be cohortative or jussive, and you'll be able to make that decision based upon the context. This concludes our lecture for Chapter 18, the volitional conjugations of the Hebrew verbal system, the imperative, the cohortative, and the jussive. For the imperative, you must memorize, like a robot, the four forms of the imperative. Second person volitional conjugation. For the cohortative and the adjussive, those forms are normally identical to the regular imperfect forms. Sometimes the cohortative is lengthened and sometimes the adjussive is shortened, but you should be able to identify each of those forms in their context. Now, before I conclude, I want to make one final summary statement, and it has to do with the different uses of the imperfect. It'll be helpful for you to observe at this point that you've now studied at least 3 different uses or translations of the imperfect verb in Hebrew. The first value of the imperfect you encountered in chapter 15. That is the imperfective translation, normally translated with the English future tense, I will kill. However, in chapter 17, we encountered the use of the imperfect with the while consecutive. When you prefix the while consecutive to an imperfect verb, you no longer translate it imperfectively, but perfectively. And I killed, simple past tense. You've now encountered in this chapter a third use of the imperfect, the volitional use. With first person and third person imperfect verbs, if they appear at the beginning of their clause and without the while consecutive, you will translate them volitionally. Let me kill. May I kill. 3 options: imperfective, perfective, and volitional. And the way in which you distinguish between these 3 options is the position of the verb in its clause, first or non-first, and the absence or the presence of the while consecutive. If you have it, it's consecutive, translate it as the past. If you don't have it, look for word order. It can be either imperfective or volitional. So it's important to be able to distinguish these 3 uses of the imperfect. In English, we use different verbs to communicate these realities. In Hebrew, they use one verb in 3 different contexts. So it's a slightly different system, and it will take time to become familiar with it. Well, that concludes our chapter. I'll see you next time.